Well, it must be the time just after the NHL draft when we suddenly reappear on your podcast channels to annoy you and to remind you that we're still around. We're still keeping an eye and an ear on things. And we want to share with you our perspective on the OHLers and others that went in that draft and maybe a few other tidbits to keep you interested over the summer because we certainly remain interested. My name is Mike Farwell, that guy over there. Dan Mahar. You'll find him on X or Twitter at his name, Dan Mahar. I'm at Farwell _ OHL. Dan, as we got ready for this week's episode, I make these notes on this pad I keep right here in my podcasting room, my home podcasting studio. And I took a look at the names we had scribbled down. So if you want to go back for proof on this, listen to our most recent episode from early June when we talked about some players that we were interested in heading into the draft. Here are the names that were written down: Parekh and Dickinson, Seneca and Greentree, Van Acker and Luchenko, Baudouin and O'Reilly. I know you were a big Baudouin guy all year, Dan. And then Danford and Muse. Those were the guys we were talking about at the beginning of June. At the end of June, when that draft happened, how do you think we did, Dansky?
I'd say we did okay, Mike. I think 9 of those names landed in round one, if I'm not mistaken.
Who had on their bingo card that there would be two Oshawa generals going in the first round in Beckett Seneca and Ben Danford?
Yeah, bookending the first round, really. And the Seneca one shocked everyone, including him and his family, apparently. If you saw the memes of his reaction, I think clearly he didn't know he was going to Anaheim at 3. I started to hear the whispers of that a few days ahead of the draft. I had known for weeks that there were teams that had him in the top 5, so it wasn't shocking to me he was going top 5 or 6. Sounded shocking to a lot of people that saw his initial rankings at the start of the year down in 25, 28 in that range. Steadily progressed. We all heard about his size improvement, if you want to call it that, over time. Came into the league at 5'10", now at 6'3". Very projectable frame. We've seen the crazy hands and skill level he has. So you could see why he'd move up that list. And with that amazing playoff he had, once he got hurt, Oshawa was not the same team. All those things led to him moving up the list. But to go 3, I think stunned even obviously him and his family. So it just shows you what can happen between the months of February and when the draft happens. So have a bad first half, have a bad 16-year-old season, throw those things out the window because you can make up for it in a couple months. I know teams are really paying attention these days to playoffs, what they do in the playoffs. So we saw that with Easton Cowan last year, right? Easton Cowan was a third rounder until the playoffs hit, and then wow, took the league by storm, and suddenly he was a first round pick. So these things happen.
I would like to hear the whispers that you hear or were hearing around draft time because most of what I was hearing still had Seneca outside the top 10, even forget the top 5. And I'm not trying to take anything away from the player. Knew he was going to be a first rounder, loved his game. You're absolutely right about that reaction. That's the stuff I think that we follow this league for, and frankly, this game, to see a genuine reaction like that when it comes to hearing your name at 3. Even the player and the family were, I would say it's fair to say, shocked by it. I wonder, Dan, how much you think it might be the Derek Laxdal factor in Oshawa. And I know it looks like, at 31, the Leafs were looking for something kind of specific when they took Danford. And we know I think he's going to be a nice, steady defenseman, but that's pretty early. Seneca earlier than thought, but we knew he was going in the first round. But do you think there's anything to Derek Laxdal, how he runs the team, the way he's able to develop and or work with players, improving their draft stock?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Like when you look at a player moving up a draft list like this, there's all kinds of factors, obviously. Credit the player at the top of that list, but right below the player, of course, is the coach he played for. There's coaches that have a track record of moving guys up the list. And when you have a guy like Laxdal with some pro experience, and you saw what he did with a Generals team this year that wasn't supposed to really come into their own until next year, suddenly people are taking note. And when you go on a longer playoff run, with every passing series and more players eliminated, you get more and more eyeballs on those players. So you tend to see those teams that go deep in the playoffs have a few kids move up the ranks. And when you look at Ben Danford, I think, Mike, going back to one of your previous pods, you saw the loose Leaf ties. Got to be his uncle is Steve Bancroft, a former Leaf draft pick in the area. There's a lot of connections there. And I think when you talk about what the Leafs were looking for, I was a little surprised at 23. I thought they might go with John Solberg, who had a great tournament in the U18s, had really leapt up the charts on his own right, being that stay-at-home physical defender. But clearly the Leafs looked at what was available and said, we got a guy pretty much in our backyard that does the same things and maybe even a little more steady than Solberg. So let's we know we can get him at 31. Let's trade that pick, add 2, and move down and get him. So I think that was the thinking, but for sure, Derek Laxdal takes a little bit of credit for that progression over the year as well.
Steve Bancroft, a former guest on this podcast, it just makes me think, damn it, I got to start getting more guests on here because I love catching up with the former players and hearing some of their stories. Member of the Kingston Sports Hall of Fame now. That's why we had him on. Go back and listen to the episode. I'm sure you'll enjoy the conversation. He was great, very forthcoming, had some great stories, and was a really good guy to talk to. Less surprising, certainly, than Seneca at 3, but not everybody had Zane Parekh top 10, and certainly not everybody had Parekh going ahead of Sam Dickinson. Now, you and I both agreed those were the top 2 D from the O going in the first round. I thought Parekh would go ahead of Dickinson. This was just after the Memorial Cup had ended. You weren't sure. You thought Dickinson might go ahead of Parekh. This is not to take anything away from Sam Dickinson. I think you kind of know what you're getting and you can project pretty well because he's just that hockey player, right? He's that prototypical future NHL defenseman. There is no question about it. I think what makes Parekh so interesting and perhaps so tantalizing is we're not 100% sure of the upside. I think there's risk with that too, because there might be a bigger downside than the steady as she goes Sam Dickinson. But I think Calgary liked that potential upside. And I can't help but wonder, Dan, if there was the Memorial Cup bump, so to speak, for Parekh going at number 9 to Calgary and then ahead of Sam Dickinson.
Yeah, it was a really tough call to figure out who was going to go first of those 2 defensemen. Admittedly, as we got close to the draft, I started leaning towards Dickinson only because of a few factors that, like you just mentioned, almost surefire top 4 defender for a number of years with that size, that skating, all-around game. I also thought some of the bumps Parekh took through the playoffs, was in and out of the lineup a bit. I thought it might have started to cast some doubt if you're looking at the top end of the draft. But I come back to a couple things that scouts always say, and that's when you're picking top 10, you pick on upside. Zane Parekh has the highest upside. And then another scout said something about that pairing that I thought really resonated. It said, there were questions about Dickinson's offensive upside. That's been all year. Is he a second pairing defenseman in the NHL, or does he have the offense to be on a top pairing? Whereas Parekh, there was no doubt if he hits. And one of the scouts said, Zane Parekh isn't surefire to hit, but if he hits, he will be the best defenseman in this draft. So you're gambling a little bit there on upside, right? So you look at the Calgary Flames, they're looking at it and saying, we're not 100% sure here. But we're picking in the top 10. We want someone that's got that upside to be a number 1 defenseman in the NHL. And like they said, if Parekh hits, he's won. So that's what the choice was.
I can't help but think there are similarities here to a couple of Ryans previously that came out of the Ontario Hockey League in Murphy and Merkley. It was Ryan Merkley, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, and I slightly different for sure. There is not nearly as much risk, in my opinion, with Parekh. But just as you're talking about that, I would make those comparisons at this point.
Yeah, and very interesting, Mike, because you're right. Like both the Ryans had phenomenal skill sets, could carry a game. Both though had severe question marks, I think, that got louder and louder as they got closer to their NHL draft year. With Ryan Murphy, arguably his best year in the OHL was his 16-year-old season. Then team started to learn to defend him, and he struggled with that in this scheme of how the team played. And then Ryan Merkley had all kinds of questions around compete level, attitude, various things that haunted him from his time even before the OHL. So when he got to the NHL draft, I think most people were convinced he was going to fall well out. I know teams had him as a do not draft, so they thought he'd slide down the list. So to go, I believe it was 23rd overall to San Jose was kind of shocking at the time. I thought, wow, that's a gamble using your first rounder on him based on all the question marks. And it's proven to kind of the question marks were legit. What I think Parak does a little bit differently than those two is the compete level is extremely high with Parak. He'll get involved physically. He'll jaw with you. He's combative. He wants to be involved in that play, and he wants to be a target. So and he's a little larger also. So I think when you look at those factors, there's that's what separates probably him from the two Ryans. But you're absolutely right in terms of the skill set they possess and the potential risk.
I want to be really braggadocious here and proclaim this to be the very best junior hockey podcast in the country. But I don't know I can be that bold because our buddy Guy Flaming out in Alberta is doing amazing work with the Pipeline Show. If you haven't checked it out, please do so. He covers the Dub and the entire league like nobody else, but specifically the Dub. I think, though, we hold our own against the Guy Flamings of the world in the Pipeline Show. And I would still argue, Dan, that we're among the luckiest because we're in the best of the three leagues. And we could further that argument by looking at the players that got picked again in this year's NHL draft. First round alone, 9 OHLers led the way from the leagues, 6 from the USHL, 5 from the double UHL, the Dub. And overall, 39 OHLers go compared to 34 in the Dub and only 15 out of the Q. And this continues a more than decade-long trend. We're going back almost 20 years now where the Q has just lagged behind when it comes to draft picks to the National Hockey League, and the Ontario Hockey League has reigned supreme in sending those players to the show.
But yeah, I've been emphatic about the OHL being the top-notch league for development. It's not a knock on the other two leagues. I feel like historically the WHL has been slightly overrated. I've said that before in terms of producing the top end guys relative to how many actually get drafted. And Quebec League, Quebec Maritime League, probably a little underrated. Having said that, when you look, I know I'm biased, but when you look at NHL rosters, the top ends of lineups, the top 6 forwards, the top 4D are littered with OHL grads. And I heard an NHL scout years back say something to the effect of if you want good third and fourth liners, go to the WHL because that's where they learn how to play that role. He didn't say the other part of that equation, which I'm saying right now, which is if you want top end of the lineup guys, look to that OHL because they're consistently churning out top end guys right now. And we saw it through the NHL playoffs all year. The teams that were battling at the end had tons of OHLers on that roster in key roles too, logging key ice. So I think we saw that's why 9 of them went in the first round, Mike. You look at all the options for players to be drafted. You're not just talking CHL, you're talking NCAA, USHL, Europe. You're talking all these different options, and yet still fully a quarter of them, more than a quarter of them went from the OHL.
Yeah. And if you want further proof of that, we talked about it in our final episodes of this season as the National Hockey League playoffs wore on. You could count double-digit numbers of Ontario Hockey League products that were members of those Final Four and ultimately championship rosters. And just on that note, can we have a moment for Paul Maurice of the Windsor Spitfires, and now, of course, a Stanley Cup champion with Florida? Can they all be Paul Maurice's?
I know the media loves Paul Maurice, right? Because he always gives you those folksy, great press conferences. And what I loved most about Paul Maurice winning was this self-deprecating nature. I mean, at no point did he ever try and take credit for he mocked himself for, oh yeah, it's 30 years without a cup. That's genius. And all the things he did. And he talked about the downturn Florida took in his first year there. And so anyway, I think that humility goes a long way in helping people like you and I raise a cup for him when he finally gets his due. So yeah, good on Paul Maurice, another OHL grad.
Former Barrie Colt, exceptional status player Aaron Ekblad dropping an F-bomb 5 words into his on-ice interview. That's not a knock. That's not a knock of Aaron Ekblad. He just won the bleeping Stanley Cup. You can let him say whatever he wants. I've never loved those interviews in the moment. I get why we do them, but I think that's why you pull a coach like Paul Maurice or any other coach at that level at that time that will give you something a little bit more measured, but nonetheless, another OHLer factoring into some memorable moments post-game Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers. Before we move on, anything else from this NHL draft, good or bad, Dan, that stood out to you?
Well, on the OHL context, Mike, I think you nailed it with 39 OHLers drafted, which is an incredible number. Every round of the draft had a bunch. I just the only things I would highlight, kind of maybe a surprise bump up. Obviously, we mentioned Seneca, but Luchenko. I know the Philadelphia Flyers really needing a center. Some people felt maybe reached a little to go with him at 14, but I mean that speaks highly to what that kid did all year, factoring in on I forget the number, something like 35% of Guelph's goals. Ton of upside there. And then on the other side, kind of surprising how low a guy slid. I mean, I have to mention Anthony Romani, do we not? I mean, falling to the sixth round after scoring 50 plus goals, just having an absolute dominant year after going undrafted the year before. And I know when you go undrafted one year, that tends to drop your stock a little bit the following year as well. But I think sixth round, I would have thought someone surely would have taken a flyer on him a little earlier. But those were the only other two things that kind of caught my eye. I'm not sure if anything jumped out at you, Mike, but
I'm glad you mentioned Luchenko because I'd kind of let it slip my mind. And when I heard him called, I remembered when his name first started getting talked about as a bubble first rounder. And I thought, Jet, who? And then, of course, I have the good fortune working in the Midwest division to see an awful lot of the Guelph Storm and Jet Luchenko. And then, obviously, when his name starts being thrown around as a potential late first rounder, you watch more closely and blah, blah, blah. But to see him go where he did in that top half of the first round is just a testament to what he was able to do. And the fact that, look, this is one, not every first rounder even pans out, but I think there's a good reason to believe that Luchenko will. And it's a testament to guys that watch this game closely tend to get these things right. Luchenko was worthy of consideration for the first round, even back before Christmas of 2023. So,
yeah, and that's high first round too, right? That's not just first round. That's not
right.
sneaking in like some of the other players did, but that's high first round, which is kudos to him, kudos to Guelph. That's doing yourself proud over the course of the year. And but on the other point I just made, I mean, I guess maybe scoring 50 goals for North Bay is just discounted. You can just ask Justin Brazeau, right? These score 50 in North Bay, and you no one pays any attention. But I wouldn't be shocked if we see Anthony Romani's name come up again down the road.
I suspect that we will. And, all this draft talk has me looking forward already. And look, we'll spend time when September rolls around and we're getting back into the hockey season and the hockey weather, and we're thinking about the start of the season in late September. So we'll have lots of time to analyze what's to come and what teams' rosters are going to look like. But let's just quickly make note of how much fun it's going to be watching Michael Misa in his draft year, third year in the league, but he was the exceptional player. So coming off a Memorial Cup championship, where will he end up? Does he want to solidify a potential first overall selection position? Porter Martone, the late birthday that's going to be here going into his draft year. So we've got some fun players to watch in our league again as they look forward to the NHL draft 2025.
Yeah, excellent point. We always look ahead pretty quickly, and if one defining characteristic of this draft came forward, it was that there was a lot of high end D. They thought as many as 6 or 7 could go in the top 10. GMs always kind of get cold feet and want the scoring forward, so we saw that change a little bit. I think it ended up being 5 of 10, but then a couple went quickly after. But this was a defense heavy draft. Everything we're hearing about next year is it's forward heavy, and the names you just mentioned right at the top of that list. I think a lot of the prelims I've seen have Porter Martone as high as 3 already. So you're going to get some heavy OHL content next year as well. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and stay tuned to Martone in Brampton, which we'll touch on more in a moment. But before we get to that, how about Brian Crawford? Welcome to the new commish, the new boss, same as the old boss, not exactly, but David Branch will be sticking around in sort of a consultant's role to help ease the transition of the man who's in his early 40s and seems to be coming into this league thinking that it's in a good position right now. It's healthy. He's going to say all of these things, of course, but B, also believes that the future looks bright for the Ontario Hockey League. Welcome to the league, Commissioner Brian Crawford.
Yeah, welcome to Brian Crawford and the track record. I mean, obviously coming from Gulf Canada, it's a little bit of a different animal, but everything I've heard and read about his work in that industry has been top notch. coming from both the player side as well as the corporate side. So I think that's probably what appealed about him to the Ontario Hockey League search was he had that background on both sides, and it's transferable regardless what sport you're working in. So it'll be very interesting to see what his priorities are. But I think a welcome after all these years to have a change like this and a fresh face come in there with some new ideas.
Just on the golf note, if I may indulge myself more than anything, bear with me through a bit of a story here. I don't know how much uh, the Canadian side of golf gets into this, but just speaking as a member of the media, I can tell you firsthand, and it probably goes without saying if you follow the game of golf at all, it lends itself really well to TV. I had the opportunity very early in my career, and it was a tremendous opportunity to work on the crew at the Canadian Open when it was at Glen Abbey one year. And so ESPN was the home broadcaster. So they bring in their production team and their production vehicles and whatnot. And then I'm just, somebody locally, if you will, hired to be on the crew. And I can tell you, I was blown away working on that crew with how much care and how much passion they had for broadcasting the game of golf. Just for example, my role was to be out on the fairway. So after the golfer hit their tee shot, I'd watch for it to land and I'd get as close as I could without getting in the way with my shotgun mic. And again, when I say a shotgun mic, that's what we called these things that are about 2 feet long. This is back in the days before they were wireless. So I had to drag a little cable behind me at all times. So there was a little bit of logistics involved to make sure I could be in a place that wouldn't disturb the golfer, that, my cable would be out of the way, all these different things. And then my job was to make sure I aimed that shotgun mic and I was close enough to catch the full sound of the swing, the contact with the ball, etc. And I'm telling you, the producer would be on you to make sure. I missed one. He was nice enough to I knew I missed it. I didn't get close enough in that particular, but anyway, my point in all of this is they take their golf incredibly seriously. I don't know from a production standpoint. I don't know how much Brian Crawford might have been exposed to that, but I'll just go back to something we talked about way back in mid-season when we had a little bit of a wish list for the incoming commissioner. I think there is tremendous opportunity in this league to elevate its broadcasts across the board. So hopefully Commissioner Crawford is open to some ideas like that and maybe brings some with him from his golfing experience. My 10 cents on that.
No, it's excellent 10 cents on the production because that's, I know, a point that you've made several times about how we can elevate in the OHL and junior hockey coverage. I think I agree. There's lots of room there to improve. And I'll just say the tie into to golf, you talk about how well it lends itself to TV. How about just a quick shout out? Can he bring some of the camera operators with him? It never ceases to amaze me how good those people are. I mean, sometimes it's hard enough following a golf ball in the air when you're there live, let alone with a camera. So it's just incredible the work they do. And if he can bring some of those principles and skills to the OHL, it's going to benefit the viewers.
Again, a little bit easier because golf doesn't move at nearly the same pace. But in terms of following the ball, you're right. And if I may, again, just from previous experience, and I've never forgotten this way back, it was actually, I was going to say early in my career, I hadn't even started yet. It was an internship when I was in broadcasting school, and I got to work on the truck for Hockey Night in Canada at Maple Leaf Gardens. And I'll tell you, the guys that did, and no offense, ladies, but they were all guys back then, the guys that did what we called the follow cam. So that's the main camera you see from a relatively high level where you see most of the ice that's following the play and the puck back and forth. And these guys were so highly sought after because they were the best of the best. And I was there on this truck. I wasn't doing that job. Believe you me, I had no business there. Then I don't have the business there now. But for Saturday games on Hockey Night in Canada, so as much as ESPN took golf seriously, we've always taken our hockey seriously. And these guys were treated like the royalty that they were because they were the most important people on the broadcast. Without a good main follow cam, nothing else really matters. And they had a little chair they'd sit in that swiveled, and they just had it was like a dance they were doing. It was brilliant to watch from the production side. So yes, you're absolutely right. And maybe we can bring some of that. Look, our arenas in junior hockey don't all lend
Yeah.
themselves to this, right? But Anyway, I'll leave all of this aside. Hopefully, the commissioner knows about the OHL podcast. We'll be nice to you until you give us a reason not to be nice. And maybe you'll pick up a few ideas. Or when we have you on this podcast for a little interview, Commissioner Crawford, we'll talk about some of these things. All right. Porter Martone and the Brampton Steelheads. We already made reference to that. Plus, lots of coaching news. And a junior hockey team is for sale in this country for how much money? Those stories still to come as we bring you this NHL draft special of the OHL podcast. I think really it's a rebrand more than a rebirth, Dan, of the Steelheads now shifting to Brampton. We talked about this when the news came out during the season. It's primarily a financial move, I would think. They're getting a better deal on the arena. So if you're going to lose some money, maybe lose less. But Mayor Patrick Brown seems to be engaged in all of this, and we now have a Brampton Steelheads in the Ontario Hockey League.
Yeah, we do, and I know there was question early on. Well, are they going to have to rebrand entirely and take a different name? And I said, well, you realize all the waterways in Brampton end up in Mississauga anyway. They're all so there's not too much Indigenous life in Brampton that isn't also existing in Mississauga. So that's how close the proximity is. So it's really almost a semantic move, I guess, Mike, at this point. And we'll see what changes are made around the arena and for game day production, that kind of thing. But I think for logistics, it's going to be very similar for the players and families involved. It's just yet another foray into Brampton, which has never worked perfectly well before, but we'll see how it goes this time.
Yeah, and I think for fans, it's going to be the same sort of idea. If you're an out-of-market fan, don't worry about showing up 10 minutes before the game and finding a seat. Junior hockey is what it is in the GTA, so I was going to say this is like polishing a turd. That's not fair. That's not kind. I don't mean it to be unkind, but you're taking a team that struggled with attendance in a market that didn't really care and relocating it to a market that's not going to care much more. It will still struggle with attendance, etc. But it does take me back to Commissioner Crawford, and in his introductory news conference, he did talk about the Greater Toronto Area and how important he believes it to be to the overall health of the Ontario Hockey League. So don't expect the GTA experiment, if you will. Can we still call it that all these years later? Probably not, but it's not going away anytime soon.
No, and it's never going to make sense to me that you have a market that people care so intensely about the NHL team and just not at all about any other level. And that's, I mean, we did see some encouraging attendance numbers for the PWHL, the Toronto Hockey Club there. So there is a market presumably for levels other than the NHL. And I just, it will never make sense to me that there's not, because stroll down the road, pay a fraction of the price and see just incredible hockey. And you referenced Porter Martone there. Hey, you want to see a kid that's probably going to go top 5 in the NHL draft next year and might be playing at the Scotiabank Arena or as an opponent or maybe on the home side, go see him for $20 next year as often as you want. Like it's crazy that the GTA market won't support this. So, but I know we're beating a dead horse at this point, Mike.
I know it's a little different too to say go and pay the price of admission just to see the goaltenders, but Ryerson Leanders and Jack Ivankovic are definitely top quality players in this league, and they will be players that you hear about down the road in hockey as well. So we had some fun towards the end of our sort of regular season of these podcasts, going around the league to our various touch points and getting at least one message or comment from people in every single market. So hello to Ontario Hockey League fans in Brampton. Say hello back. You can email anytime, ohlpodcast@rogers.com, or leave a comment on the podcast or on the YouTube channel. But also tell a friend about this great brand of hockey that's coming to the beautiful city of Brampton for the upcoming season. One of the other things that was announced, and I guess this is the end of the Canada-Russia sort of super series in the CHL, but we've got the CHL USA Prospects Challenge coming our way in the seasons ahead.
I think this one's potentially got a lot more marketing potential. It's going to draw a lot more interest across the board. I know NHL scouts love it because you're pitting these really high-end guys against each other from two different associations. There's a lot of factors to consider here. I mean, obviously, people are going to take more interest when the teams make more sense. You got your Canadian kids playing against the NCAA kids. And having said that, there's a couple factors to consider. A lot of the American kids play together all year. They on the national team development program. There's going to be a familiarity there that you think that would be advantageous to them. But I think every kid that's looking to get drafted in the CHL is going to relish this opportunity to play in this format. It's going to draw a lot more eyeballs. It's going to give you a really good feel for who's who. Because when the NHL draft comes around and you see that top 10, Mike, every year, the top round, it's almost back and forth. CHL, NCAA, CHL, and there's obviously a few Europeans sprinkled in there, but this will give you a really good measuring stick of how these kids playing in the USHL do measure up against the CHL counterparts. And anyway, I think it's a really good, interesting idea. I think it's going to be intriguing for a lot more viewers. So we'll see how it goes, but I think it did need some fresh ideas, and this is probably the one that's been on the tip of the tongue for most scouts for a while.
I think that's a really good point on sort of the freshness of it. And you got to think, Dan, that one of the other subplots here, or one of the other layers to all of this, is, of course, the uh, changing of the understanding between the CHL and the NCAA, where if you lace up for one game in the CHL, previously, of course, you could not play in the NCAA. We're seeing movement on that front, and I can't help but think this just adds another level of intrigue to the movement that will be happening between the two leagues.
Right, and so should it, right? I mean, we know it's been long overdue for that archaic rule to be abandoned. It looks like more through legislative means it's going to happen than actual will to do it. Having said that, it's all better for everyone in the long run. It's certainly better for the players when they might have that flexibility to come back and forth. And there's always going to be extremely healthy competition between these leagues. There's a heavy recruiting competition, obviously, and then there's the bragging rights, like what's the better developmental league, and this will start to help foster that and grow the game and get more eyeballs on these options. Because generally, what's happened up till now is, if you're on the NCAA side or USHL side, you don't want to give any air time or any oxygen to the CHL because you want that to be forgotten, and vice versa. Well, let's kind of be more honest here and open, and let's just put it all out on the table. Say here's both levels, both terrific levels. Let's have the competition showcase itself head to head. I mean, everyone's clamoring for best on best with the NHL, right? With the World Cup coming back, and this is similar. I know it's a one game showcase; it'll always be a showcase, but I think it's long overdue.
I'm thinking similarly to you, Dan, to that end, because I think you just nailed it here. There would be a lot of people have talked about like the risk that's involved here. Oh my gosh, the CHL is going to get exposed because the NCAA is a so much better a development league, and we've just been ignoring it, or they've been pretending it didn't exist. You know what's going to make both leagues better? Competing transparently head to head, because it's just going to make them that much better to try to stay superior. I still believe the OHL/CHL is the better route. I know there are those who devoutly believe the same of the NCAA. Great. Let's put them up against each other. I'll take it back to what I said earlier about the pipeline show that Guy Flaming is doing out in Alberta, looking at the junior hockey in this country and how good his show is, and how I hope you listen to it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that other podcasts and other commentators don't exist. I want to be as good as Guy. I want Guy to listen to what we do and elevate his game, and it goes like that. I think the competition and the openness of it, just that rising tide, to use the cliche, raises all boats. I think this is a great thing. I can't wait to watch it.
Yeah, if you're good at what you do, you shouldn't be afraid of the competition, right? You should relish it, and at the end of the day, it makes everyone better. And I know the economic reasons for that way it's been, but I think this is just going to be step one, like you said, Mike, in a changing tide here, and I think it's going to benefit the ones that should benefit the most from it, and that's the players.
There was a joke this past season in the OHL delivered by a buddy of mine who's in the Dub now. And he said, the OHL has changed more coaches in one season than we in the Dub have changed in 3 years. There was a lot of change behind benches this past season in the OHL. And that trend continues, if you will, into the offseason, or maybe just some of these spots are getting filled. Before we talk about some of the bigger moves, how about the World Junior announcement that came down just before we actually recorded this episode of our OHL podcast? Dave Cameron and Chris Lazary behind the bench for Team Canada.
Yeah, we know Dave Cameron has that experience, right? So, and when you're in the Hockey Canada loops, you get these opportunities, and I think Dave Cameron has done everything in his career to earn these opportunities. But it's really good to see Chris Lazary added to the bench this year. I mean, who earned it more this year than he did? Obviously, the Memorial Cup championship and just a dominant year all the way through. So it's great to see him elevate. You see his career trajectory is headed up and up and up, and this is an assistant coach year, and I wouldn't be shocked if Chris Lazary gets a head coach year down the road before too long.
Really interesting point, and the way you just described that for Lazary and that trajectory. So I've gotten to know Laz pretty well through this game. He cut his teeth, if you will, at a higher level, of course, with the Waterloo Siskins right in my hometown, and won a Cherry Cup there. We've kept in touch as he moved through his coaching, Sarnia, then to Saginaw. I wish I had talked to him. I haven't talked to him since the Memorial Cup, and that's on me. But I get the sense, Dan, and I have for a while, that Chris Lazary, much like anybody really involved in the game, certainly at his age, he's not an old man by any stretch, is thinking about, the possibility of being behind a National Hockey League bench someday. I know both he and Dave Drinkle just re-signed multi-year contracts in Saginaw. I don't think that Chris Lazary is in any particular hurry, but this is just another rung on that ladder that I believe ultimately will lead Chris Lazary into the National Hockey League. And I think that's what he aspires to. I don't blame him for that. And I think the track record shows, the pedigree to date shows that he's on a collision course with the National Hockey League, and deservingly so. On the Dave Cameron front, I can't tell you how happy I am for Dave Cameron, the person in all of this. So here's a guy that is on his second tour through this Ontario Hockey League, right? Having been there with Mississauga St. Mike's when they went to the Memorial Cup when they hosted back in 2011, and had a kick at the can in the National Hockey League, didn't work out there, was over in Europe, and then boom, shows up in Ottawa. I wish we got to go to Ottawa more often as a Western Conference broadcaster, for so many reasons, because I really do love the city. But getting the chance to chat with Dave Cameron last season when we made the trip up to the nation's capital, you found a guy who's really at peace, loving what he's doing, loving working with kids at this level. And then to get this opportunity added to it, I think that's got to be like the proverbial cherry on top of the sundae. So I'm just thrilled for the guy as a person. He's been doing great stuff in Ottawa, and I think this is a worthy recognition for a guy that's really done well for himself in the game.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, you look at careers in hockey, it's a tough gig coaching in general. To get to the pinnacle, which is the NHL, very near impossible for most coaches. Those that do achieve it, often you don't stay long in one gig. You can take three or four before you have any success, if at all. But then you take a step back to the junior loops and you look at a resume like Dave Cameron. I mean, how much more is there to achieve there? He's pretty much done it all. So yeah, should be very proud of himself and everything he's achieved there. And if you can stick it out in Ottawa for a bunch of years, I think there was another guy that did for a few years there as well, and he did okay without moving on to the NHL.
He certainly did. Excellent reference. Anytime we can even make a passing reference to Brian Kilray, it's a very good day on this podcast. One of the more surprising, I would say, I think Ted Dent might be the most surprising so early in the season last year with his dismissal in Flint, but the Greg Walters firing in Owen Sound. Now, we learned a little bit more after the fact. There had been an altercation, a verbal altercation that led ultimately to Walters' suspension from the league, but he was a winning coach at the time. The Owen Sound attack hadn't come out of the gates the way everybody thought they would, perhaps, but nonetheless, a coach that had been having signs of success on the ice, dismissed, then the suspension follows. Had it not been for the suspension, there were a lot of rumblings that Walters was going to be installed as the head coach in Windsor. Then the suspension comes, and no sooner is Walters reinstated by the Ontario Hockey League than what I think everybody thought was inevitable occurred. And Greg Walters, former Oshawa General and Owen Sound attack coach, is now the bench boss in the border city.
You're right. It wasn't the best kept secret that this was heading this way. But yeah, and you look at you referenced the altercation that happened in Owen Sound when things kind of went early in the season when it was a winning team and they had pretty high hopes for that team and things kind of went off the rails there. And And when you talk about being reinstated and without getting into the weeds of what did or did not happen, and you just hope that people learn from these things and what you can and can't do. And there's conduct that is okay, and there's conduct that's not. And you like to see second chances. And I think Greg Walters has proven he's a good hockey coach when he has things he brings to the table. He likes that rugged team that can defend, and I think fans in Windsor should be pretty buoyed to get a guy with that skill set behind the bench. So we'll see how this goes, but that's got to be I think a win for Windsor.
I hope we get more of the Greg Walters from his introductory press conference through the season. The best team, not just the best team in the CHL, but the best junior team in the world, says Greg Walters, are the Windsor Spitfires. Now, listen, Memorial Cups in 2009, 10, and 17 as hosts. I get it, but I mean, we could probably spend an entire episode or an entire season debating the best team in the world, but Greg Walters certainly loves the perch that he has landed on. And like I said, bring that. Tell us you've got the best power play in the world, not just in the league or the division. Like, let's go. I want more of that brutal honesty or braggadocious honesty, as the case may be. Okay, along with Walters in Windsor, from Humboldt, Saskatchewan, former Peterborough Pete. And of course, it's worth mentioning Humboldt because we all remember the Humboldt Broncos tragedy. Scott Barney shepherded this young Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League team through that, and he did so with flair, with care, with patience. He developed players. He had guys going D1 out of the Saskatchewan Junior League, and now the former Peterborough Pete is going to be behind the bench for the Sudbury Wolves. Not a bad hire for a team that fell a little short of expectations last season, Dan.
Yeah, I know at the time when Scott Barney went out to Humboldt, he talked about really wanting to be there, feeling like he wanted to be a part of that and help that healing and move them forward. And good on him for having that instinct and doing what he did over the last couple of years. But yeah, another one that I feel like has to be a bit of a coup for Sudbury. They've had, let's just be honest, they've had a couple questions behind the bench, I suppose, the last several years. Not a ton of stability, not a ton of success, really, especially at the key times of year. And you get a guy like Scott Barney, who, I mean, as a top prospect when he played himself in Peterborough, a big swift centerman that was highly thought of at the time, and then a pro career where it bounced around a lot of levels. This guy has just been gaining experience, knowledge, insights, all those things that you need to come back and do this job effectively. So it has to be a name that you've got to be pretty happy with, I think, if you're the Sudbury Wolves.
I don't know if this came across your radar, Dan. I wasn't looking for it. I think I kind of stumbled across it, and I wasn't really sure what the real motivation was or if there was an attempt to create a controversy where one didn't exist. But I saw some commentary that suggested that it was an embarrassment to both the Ontario Hockey League and the Sudbury Wolves that it was Humboldt making the announcement before the Wolves did. So Humboldt congratulated their former head coach, Scott Barney, on his hiring with the Sudbury Wolves of the OHL. And I don't know, like I said, this kind of came across my radar, and I thought, well, I don't know what the big deal really is. Is there supposed to be some sort of agreement between leagues that they announce at the same time? Are we supposed to coordinate our media releases, so to speak? I don't know. I thought that might have been mountains out of molehills, but I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on it or it even came across your radar, Dan.
It did. I saw some of those criticisms at the time, and I agree with you, Mike. I don't make too big a deal out of this. Obviously, you'd like it to be rolled out the proper way and have the team hiring him have the opportunity to announce it. But then you might have people on Humboldt side saying, "Hey, how's this guy getting hired? You didn't tell us he was leaving." But anyway, I think all that we really are dealing with there is, the social media folks on these various teams often. Sometimes part-timers, they're not always necessarily looped in. Maybe it's just they didn't think they were doing anything wrong to put out a social media post to congratulate him on leaving, but there was no coordination with the Wolves, and that probably just took a phone call or two at the executive level between those teams saying, "Hey, like, we're going to announce this on Thursday. Can you kind of wait till then?" That call obviously didn't get to the right ears, but you're right, mountain out of a molehill.
This speaks to something that my time in the league, I've grown pretty passionate about. And look, I'm not going to claim to understand the business model at all. I'd be happy to be a fly on the wall in the board of governors meetings if they'll have me. I'll keep everything off the record, I promise. But I think for a league that does such a good job at the on ice product, that's developing players, we've talked about this already on this episode, like it is such a high quality league. I do think that once we get beyond, head coaches and general managers, things kind of fall off in the front office of hockey operations. And I'm not trying to poo-poo on anybody's efforts in this league, no matter their role. I don't think the financial model exists so that you can have every position covered by a full-time experienced employee, et cetera. So that kind of phone call that you allude to, Dan, could happen. And remember too, we're talking about different leagues in different provinces. It's not even the WHL. So at the same level as the O, it's the Saskatchewan Junior League, and who they might have a volunteer running their social media. In Sudbury, it's I can tell you from experience, it's kind of a skeleton staff. That's how the organization is run. And that's not a knock on it. That's just the reality. What I love for every team to have, 7 or 8 different full-time positions covering all these various things so that there could be this coordination. Sure. But definitely not a hill I'm going to die on. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but it ties into one of the other things I want to mention. But I wish that we could have, front offices that match the level on the ice.
You raise an interesting point, Mike, because you're right. This league is so good. It's so professionally run. Everything looks big and professional. And we sometimes forget that these are pretty skeleton staff organizations. There isn't this, because they present so well, we often think of them same as the NHL team. Well, why didn't they do this? Or why don't they do that? They can afford this, well, no, they're actually doing really good things with fairly limited resources in a lot of markets, a lot of cases. So when things like this slip through the cracks, don't forget that we're not talking about a staff of 100 like you might see at the Toronto Maple Leafs front office or the Montreal Canadiens. You're dealing with a couple full-timers who have 3 or 4 different jobs and then a few part-time people. And it's so sometimes the appearance outweighs the actual reality. So keep that in mind. These aren't massive, rich organizations. They just kind of look that way because it's done so well.
And a whole lot of interns and volunteers on game days as well. Please don't take this as criticism. I love what this league is able to do, and each individual team I get to associate with all of these sort of behind the scenes people every night I'm at a rink. I love what you do, and I love the effort you put in. We're just saying in that perfect world, if the financial model made it viable, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice, as the Beach Boys once sang? That brings me around to this story from the Prince George Citizen a few weeks ago. Look, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the WHL or administration, front office, the business of the Canadian Hockey League generally, but I thought it interesting that the Prince George Citizen reported that the Cougars in Prince George may be up for sale. Some have thrown cold water on the story already. That's fine. What stood out to me was the asking price, and reportedly at $8 million. So as much as we just talked about, Dan, the financial model isn't anywhere close to the National Hockey League, et cetera. $8 million for a junior hockey team is not chump change, at least from where I'm sitting here in Kitchener.
Definitely not. And with all due respect to the lovely town of Prince George, to a bit of an outpost too, right? It's not necessarily the largest market with the biggest economy and biggest set of corporate funding around. So yeah, when you see that price tag, you kind of raise an eyebrow, right? And wonder who's going to have that money to locate there and do those kind of things. But I think the main thing that Prince George fans were happy to hear was the current ownership group saying that there's no, they kind of threw water on the idea of moving the franchise. I know we're committed to so we'll see how that plays out. You never like to see a team move, but that $8 million price tag does give you a sense of where these franchises are valued. Obviously, whether you quibble over whether that should be 7 or 6.5, you're in the ballpark, right? So it's getting to be big enough business, but it does make you raise an eyebrow to think, what are some other franchises potentially worth?
Exactly. So I know for sure I'm going to have to stop playing the Ontario 49 lottery. It's got to be Lotto Max or 649 if I ever want to achieve my dream of Ontario Hockey League ownership. I can't wait to buy a team, Dan.
Well, count me in for minority share. We'll say like a 0.0001% stake if I could. So.
That goes without saying. You're like, listen, by virtue of being willing to sit down with me every week on this damn podcast, you're already a minority owner of my future OHL team.
Sweet. And I'll
You're
handle the media room spread. How's that?
perfect. That's what more can I ask for? You know exactly what I want because you've heard me complain about it time and again. You're a good man, Dan Mahar. That is his name. Find him on Twitter, X at Dan Mahar. My name is Mike Farwell at Farwell_OHL. Send us an email anytime, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. If the spirit moves us, we might pop back into your feed sometime over the summer. We'll be back in full force in September for sure, though, as we get set for that late September start to the season and another year here on the OHL podcast.